Hi, I'm Jim with Agape Bibles. Today is August 20th, 2022, and I'm going to show you how to make leather piping for your leather projects. I hope you enjoy it. Today I'm going to show you how to make leather piping for your bags. And most bags will require you to splice your leather piping because, well, you're just not going to get a long enough strip to cover the entire bag. The carry-out bag that we're making is 30 and 1/4 inches long, and I'm using goat skin for the leather piping because it's very thin and very durable. But my hide is not that long, so I need to splice it. So I've cut two pieces, roughly about 17 inches long, and I've squared off the edges on one end of the leather that I'll be using piping. And then you're going to need some fabric. This is just cheap old fabric that I've cut into 1 3/4 strips, and then I've cut two pieces that are 3 inches long by 1 3/4. Then you're going to need some piping core, and what I use mostly is this weed eater line, and it's a 0.095 inches in diameter. Most of my computer bags that I make have a large radius, so it bends very nicely. However, when you're trying to make a tighter radius, it doesn't want to bend. It's very springy and it's very hard to work with. So when I'm making a bag that has a smaller radius, I use a synthetic core. And this is it's a number 00 or number 00. It's 4 4/32 in diameter, or 3 millimeters in diameter. And this stuff is very flexible, and it will allow you to bend into a tighter radius. You're also going to need contact cement, and that's going to be used to seal and glue your piping together with the cord in it, so you can sew it to your piece. So with that said, what we're going to have to do is splice our piping. So I know I've got to have 30 1/4 inches long, so I've cut these about 18 inches long, two of them, and so I'm going to mark down here at about 1.5 inches, and this is going to be my glue line. And I'll do the other one at about 1.5 inches. Doesn't have to be exact. So now we're going to glue this up and make our splice. If you go over your line, it's not a big deal. It's not going to hurt anything at all. Just want to make sure you got enough glue on here. I say glue, it's contact cement. contact cement on our piece of fabric as well. And we want to put some cement on the edges of our splice piece. And if you get some glue on the finished side of the hide, don't worry about it. When the cement dries, it'll peel right off. No damage. It's all good. Get enough of that. Get a little bit more cement. Okay. Get that out of our way. I think that's tacked up pretty good. So now what we're going to do is put this fabric in the splice, and that's going to give it support. It doesn't have to be exact or perfect. I'll work right about there. Take my roller tool and roll that down. So now what we do is put this all around. And we'll take our squared off edge and marry it to the one that we just glued the fabric to. So there's going to be our seam. If you have fabric hanging out, you can trim it up or just leave it alone. It's not going to hurt anything. So now we got a pretty good seam. And we'll let that set up for just a bit, and I will be right back. I guess I forgot to mention how wide do I cut my piping. For the diameter of piping core that I'm using, I cut this at 1.5 inches wide. And then you got to calculate the length that you're going to make. And 1.5 inches wide seems to work out very good for me, because once I start sewing it, I take about 1/4 inch seam to sew, and using a welting foot on my machine, 1.5 inches wide seems to come out very good for me. So the next step that you need to do is try to figure out how long do I actually need my piping to be. And what I've come up with is to take my piece. This is going to be, this is my end piece. This is the height, and this is the width. So I mark on here that this is going to be the top, and that's the bottom. And I use a centering rule to find the center of my piece. And that's going to be right. Let's see. Getting a little glare here, and it's 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. That's pretty close right there. So I'll mark a center line on the bottom, and I'll do the same for the top. Didn't have to be exact, just close. So now I've got to figure out how much piping do I need to go around the perimeter. The easiest method I've learned or discovered is to use a piece of string. So I take a little clippy, I just clip that down so it doesn't move on me while I'm trying to string this. And I just kind of walk this around. I'm sure there's probably an easier way, but this is the way I've found that works best for me. Just giving you a rough idea, because when you trim, you want to make sure you have enough to finish the seam. And so my thread's pretty close, so I know that my piece is going to have to be at least this long. And if I take the edges where I pre-marked this to the halfway point, and I lay this down on the seam, so now I know how long I'm going to need, and I've got plenty of piping to splice this. So that's how I determined how long I needed to cut those pieces. So now the next step is to put the piping together. And when I cut these pieces of piping, I put a piece of Scotch tape on it so it doesn't frazzle out, but it looks like I missed that one, but that's okay. So now we need to find the center of these. Doesn't have to be exact, in the ballpark somewhere, and we're good to go. So that's about where my center is going to be. There we go. So the next step is we want to secure our piping seam first, and then work out toward the ends. So we're going to have to glue this up. Another tool that you're going to need is a bone folder. Okay, it's going to be a pretty good start. So I know my seam is right here, and here's my center. So I'm just going to lay that in here. Kind of tap it down a little bit to kind of secure it. Let that cement set up just a little bit more. I think we're good. So starting in the middle, you fold your piping over, matching your seams to the edge, and work outwards. I don't go all the way to the end because I've got to glue more as I work out on each end. I just wanted to get that seam started so it doesn't move. And if you don't get exactly out to the edge or line your edges up, it's not a big deal because it's all going to be hidden when you sew it. So we're good there. So now, I take my bone folder and come in here and try to get that leather pushed up tight on that piping. And work that seam. Come down and really try to get that edge locked in and glued down. And I take it and flip it over and repeat. that secured. So there we have our seam, and it may not go clear flush, but once you sew it, it'll pull in there and be very unnoticeable. So now what we need to do is finish putting our piping in, and let me finish doing each end and I'll be back. Okay, so we've got the rest of the piping all glued, and I marked using my string that I had from the center, and I marked the ends on each side. And I want to leave some area open so I've got some room to work with when I make the seam at the top. So now we've got to do a dry run, and remember, our piping is going to go in between the end with the piping is going to be next to the face of the leather, and then the rest of the bag will be turned that face to face. So we're going to have the rough edge for the liner, and when we put it to the bag, we're going to have the rough edge up. So this is going to be sandwiched in between. So with that said, I'm going to turn our piping this way. Oop, sorry about that. That way. And we find our seam, and it's going to be right there. So take a little clip, put it on, because we're going to sew this to this end piece, and take another clip. Now, you can do it 1 or 2, 3 different ways. You can clip all the way around to get your measurement exact where you're going to have to cut that seam. I don't like to do that because these clips can slip, especially when you're going around a tight corner. They pop out, they don't line up. So what I do, I've got a Bostage hand stapler. It's a model 103339, and I got 3/8 inch crown staples. And remember, when you're stitching this, your machine foot is going to ride this ridge on the piping, and it's going to put stitches, and it's going to pull this, and it's all going to be stitched up in this area right in here. So that's your seam. Anything past here, you're really not going to see. So what I do, I just come in here, put a little staple in. I had to reload my staple because I was out of them. Take that off, and I just work my way around. And then you're going to have to pull the staples off when you make the seam. But these holes is not going to be a big deal. Not a big deal at all. So as we keep working around, I'm going to make these curves and get the leather flush with each other. So when we're finished, the measurement that you took with a string is not going to be exact. And that's why we're going to do a dry run here to make sure we get the right length before we do any cutting on it. So now as I come up here, I've got my line. And so I'm going to mark this one right there. And this side, I'm going to do the same. Up here, and mark right there on my line. So now I know I've got to cut here and make it square so it will match with this mark. And I'll make my seam using my other piece of cloth that I cut at first. Now, what I like to do is I don't want these ends to meet exactly here. I want to carry I want to cut one of them back, further back in here, and then lay that past the seam, so the seam of the core is not laying on the seam of that, and it gives a little bit more strength. So let me get that all measured up, and then we pull our staples out so we can do the seam. Let me get that done and I'll be back. Okay, so I got my pieces cut and squared, and I've measured 1.5 inches, just like we did for the first splice, here to here, and that's where my material is going to lie, and same thing over here. And what I did with this core, I cut that off just past where my fabric's going to be, and when we marry these like this core is going to extend over here, and I'll have to trim that off. So let me get this fabric put in, and I'll show you how I did the core. Okay, so I've got the material put on the first piece, and now I'm going to marry them. I got to flip it over. Be very careful that you get the piping all facing the same way. I have been known to get in a hurry, and when I flip it over I get it twisted, and then I marry it, and it doesn't work that way. So you have to take it off and start over again. So we're going to flip this over. Everything's lined up correctly. And to get our seams pretty close. That seems to be pretty close. I'm using a bone folder on this one. Okay, now we need to figure out where to cut this piping. So I'm just kind of laying that in here. And it looks right about here is where I want it. I'll take my scalpel and cut it. Now we will go back and put a contact cement in here, lay all this in here, and then fold it up, and we're ready to attach it to the end piece. So let me get that all put together, and then I'll be back. And so there you have your splice. Now when you're laying up against a straight surface, and once you start sewing, the splice is not going to be very noticeable unless you know exactly what you're looking for. If you try to make a splice on a curve, it's going to pull away and you're going to have a gap. So always try to make your splice on a straight line and it'll work for you. So that's how you splice. Piping, leather piping. Now I'm going to go ahead and staple it onto my end piece and get ready to sew it. Okay, so we got her all stapled around. See, there you go. And now it's ready to be sewn on my Cobra 26. So we're going to just take a very short stitch in here. I'm not going to go 1/4 inch, probably about 3/16 of an inch from the edge. All we need to do is sew the edges together, so when we put the bag together, we don't have to fight this piping. It'll already be attached. We just lay it over, and then we can stitch. Now I used a MP4 Cobra skiving machine to skive these edges. It's a lot easier, it's a lot faster than hand skiving. And I'm not that good at hand skiving, but I do love my MP4 skiver. So my center lines that I had marked, they match up with my splices. Everything looks good, and once we finish the bag and use that welting foot, you'll hardly ever notice the splice. Next step, sewing machine. So we're getting ready to sew up the piping that I've got attached to the end piece using this Cobra Class 24 sewing machine. I do have a drop down edge guide, and it helps me keep my stitches straight. So what I'm going to do is I want to adjust this edge guide to take about a 3/16 inch sew line. Yeah, I'll do it. It doesn't have to be pretty. It You don't have to be exact because this stitch will not show in the bag. And in case anybody's wondering, I'm using a 1/38 thread. So here we go. And there you have it. Now we'll go pull our staples out. I'll do the other end piece offline.